California is a place that's fixed itself multiple times, right? Like it's a place that's had crises and structural problems that seem totally unsolvable that time and time again the state has fixed. The actual form that the California dream takes changes. It always has changed. It doesn't have to be this way, and we know this because it didn't used to be this way. Like something happened in the 70s, 80s, 90s. California is this like ferment of places because we're at the frontier of a bunch of like social and economic phenomenon. It's chaotic and it's messy and it's frustrating, but honestly, where else would you want to be? California goes from that to this place of, oh man, paradise lost, like everybody's leaving, everybody's moving away. It's like, I just think that's totally tragic. I think that's awful, and I want to make California a place where people are eager to come and build their dreams.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the California Future Society podcast. Today, this episode is all about housing. So I was looking at some research from the Public Policy Institute of California. What was the number one reason that people left the state of California over the last decade? It was housing. Unsurprising. 750,000 people over the last decade left the state saying that the number one reason was because housing prices were too high. But it wasn't always this way. In that same study, the decade before, that number was less than 130,000. Housing costs have become our state's number one problem. Everyone admits it. Everyone's talking about it. But what's being done to solve it? It's frustrating because housing is a self-inflicted wound. It's due to bad policy and an unwillingness to build. But there's also an upside to that problem. We talked about this last week with Grow SF. Policy problems can be solved. They can be fixed. Bad policy can be changed. That's why this week I'm talking to Nolan Gray from California YIMBY. YIMBY stands for Yes in My Backyard. It's opposed to NIMBY, someone who opposes housing. And they're the premier housing advocacy group in California, fighting to change state law to ensure that California builds the housing it needs. The conversation is great. We talk about how California wasn't always expensive. We talk about what California YIMBY is doing right now to change it. We talk about how you can get involved and help support their legislation. We also talk about how the California dream has evolved over the decades, and also even how Nolan's career developed. I think he's a really interesting person, so I found that really interesting. I'm sure you will too. As always, the best way to follow it is to subscribe at californiafuturesociety.com or wherever you're seeing this or hearing this. I know you'll enjoy the conversation. With that, here's Nolan. Nolan, great to have you on. For those who don't know, Nolan Gray is a public intellectual, a writer, the Senior Director of Legislation and Research at Cal YIMBY. He's wrapping up a PhD in urban planning at UCLA, and he wrote the book on zoning. You should all get it. He blogs, he tweets, he teaches, he testifies in Sacramento, and today he's here talking to me about the future of California. Good to have you on, Nolan.
Thanks so much, Jared. It's great to be chatting with you.
Likewise. I was curious as I was thinking about how to describe you to people who might not know you beyond just the intro, and I was thinking to myself, I think of you as like the most visible YIMBY personality online. Do you agree with that description? Does that feel uncomfortable to say? I don't know. What do you think about that? I realize there's several qualifiers there, but what do you think about that?
Yeah, so many thoughts. It's funny that you raised this now because at the time we're recording, and I guess I'll still be doing this when you release this, I'm doing a little bit of a social media fast. So I'm still going on X and Blue Sky to post for like work-related stuff. My rules are like I go on and post during like 9 to 5 hours, and I don't read responses generally, and I don't like browse my feed. But yeah, I think there was a real upswing in what we call the posting to policy pipeline in the 2010s, and it's still happening in places like Substack in a really cool way. But very online. I have conflicted feelings about where social media has gone and the future of it. I think it's migrating toward actually healthier formats like podcasting and blogging. But I'll take it.
Hopefully this can be a healthy addition to the online discourse. And I know we've spoken before and we've gotten dinner and you've talked about, your own entrance into the YIMBY movement and how it's evolved over the years. But I'm curious, as someone who's been grown up kind of in your public intellectual life alongside the YIMBY movement, how has the movement transformed since you joined? And also, do you remember where you were when you first heard the word YIMBY?
Wow. That's an interesting question. I've been asked about 1,000 times how I became a YIMBY, but I don't actually know that I can recall the first time I ever heard the term YIMBY. I would suspect it was probably like a lot of people. I read a great classic blog post by Kim My Cutler, something to the effect of how burrowing owls lead to vomiting anarchists, where she's kind of trying to explain the opaque rules that blocked the housing that the Bay Area needed that resulted in this very toxic politics. And I think she probably uses the term YIMBY in that article. But YIMBY first started to trickle up in the early to mid 2010s out of the Bay Area. And I was following a lot of those conversations. I was reading like the Market Urbanism blog back in the day. I was reading Matt Iglesias when he was putting out stuff like the rent is too damn high. There was a sort of like there was an idea and a set of ideas that started to bubble up, and then at some point it got a name. And I don't remember exactly when I heard the name, but it's been remarkable in terms of how the movement's changed over the course of my involvement. Um, I think it came from being this sort of like explosion of energy of a sort of very particular set of activists in the Bay Area to being this like frankly very formalized international movement. I think actually this is something that makes me a little bit anxious is on the one hand we're building these large well-funded professional organizations with a lot of amazing staff, and like I don't think there's a problem with that as somebody who's at a well-funded and a professional at one of these organizations. On the other hand, it's the I think we've done a good job of maintaining some of that local grassroots energy. It's funny whenever a YIMBY group forms in any given city, all the local NIMBYs and establishment people are like, "Oh, who's funding this?" And it's like I guarantee you, like 99.9% of the time, it's like a small precocious group of friends who are like, "Let's form a YIMBY chapter and like emulate what people are doing in other cities." So I would say that's how it's changed. It's matured, I think, a little bit. And you see this with individual activists who I know who it's like, wow, you used to be a bomb thrower and now you like are doing like a multi-year legal strategy, right? Like so you see that transformation. I'd also say it's become a lot more diverse from its like standard, you know, white and Asian young techies in the Bay Area to you go to a YIMBY meeting now and it's like there's a large diversity, of course, races and ethnic groups. There's large diversity of age. Age is, I think, the really important one that surprises people because the rhetoric around this space used to be
Hmm.
so, I would say, soft ageist of like, complaining about boomers. And it's like now that boomers are actually showing up at YIMBY meetings, people are like, okay, let's actually stop saying that. Or like now that AARP like is a great housing champion in many state houses, it's like, okay, stop it with that type of rhetoric and like let's be inclusive. So that's another way that I think it's changed, certainly unambiguously for the positive.
I want to talk about the evolution of the YIMBY movement, specifically in California, because I think it's at an interesting turning point. And we're recording this the day after Florida just won the national basketball championship. So I was asking myself, man, if the California YIMBY movement was a basketball program, what would it be? I'm curious if you agree or disagree with my analogy. I picked Gonzaga. So I say that in that Gonzaga it's by all measures, a very successful program, but it's kind of in an awkward middle as far as expectations. Because for those who don't know, Gonzaga, it's outside the major conferences, small school in Eastern Washington, but it has just outperformed all expectations. It's incredibly effective. They win a ton of games in this regular season. They win a ton of games in March, and they're a successful program. But as a result of their success, they now are judged by a very different set of standards than any other program of their tier. And so now people say, yes, they're successful, but are they as successful as your beloved Kentucky Wildcats or Duke or some of these other big major powerhouse programs? So it's kind of in that transition point. And tell me if you agree or disagree, because for YIMBY, by all measures, it's incredibly successful, right? The California YIMBY was founded in 2017. It's passed like 18 bills. It's had a ton of success, but now because of its success, people view it as like, hey, this is a powerhouse. This is a movement in California. It's a well-funded organization. And so it's judged by a higher standard than, a scrappy group of activists from a certain region. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Push back if you don't.
I've never been asked a question more perfectly optimized for my interest. As you know, I'm from Kentucky and I'm an obsessive Kentucky basketball fan. And yeah, congratulations to Florida. Like they're sort of soft rivals, but once Duke was knocked out, we all breathed a sigh of relief, and it's good to see the title stay in the SEC. Gonzaga, I think that's a great. I love your comparison. I would up the stakes a little bit. I think the YIMBY movement's a lot like Connecticut, where it's like, okay, some big real wins here, and in this thing that people kind of maybe thought was a flash in the pan was like a one coach phenomenon. Actually, is like, oh, okay, maybe there's actually a program here. I say this in part because when Cal left Kentucky basketball, I really wanted us to hire Dan Hurley, but he's got too good of a thing going up there. He would never leave. As a program that I think kind of came out of nowhere and had some really successful big wins, and then everybody was like, okay, this can't possibly last, and it stuck around. And maybe it's an apt metaphor of now this year, Connecticut, I think, kind of at least that was a hard loss for them, but I think that a program where it's like very young, very new, has had a lot of success, and there's a question of like, is this going to mature into a blue blood program? Is this like a program that's going to permanently stay around? And it's seeming like yes, but I'll take Gonzaga's also very flattering. As long as you don't compare us to Duke.
I never would. You'll never find me doing that. Yeah, I didn't want. Glad it was close. At least I think Connecticut makes sense as well. And let's talk about the success of the California YIMBY movement and where it stands, because what got me thinking about this question of where to gauge expectations and its performance is in part was just some of the conversation around the successes that it's had and their ability to transform into housing on the ground. Because I know earlier this year there was a YIMBY law report analyzing how many homes have actually been built from some of these landmark bills that were incredible political feats that prior to California YIMBY, people wouldn't have even thought that those things would be able to pass. And there was success in passing them, but I know a lot of research is focused on, evaluating the impact on how, the ADU law, for example, streamlining ADUs has been a massive success, led to tons of homes. Some of the others, like SB9, they've been successful, they passed, but they haven't led, at least yet, to the housing transformation that people hoped for when they passed. So I want to talk about, before we get into the specific bills of this year, just kind of what is the mood within the YIMBY camp in California and thinking about the success so far and whether it has or hasn't translated to new housing starts.
Yeah, I think there's a real sense of urgency. I think there's a feeling of, hey, we've been at this work for a little bit. Where are the cranes, right? I think the way we think about it is you have a spigot. How do we get homes to come out of the spigot? And there's 3 valves that are closed. There's zoning. If the housing's illegal to build, it doesn't matter everything else, right? So you got to open that spigot. You got to get the streamlining. You got to get the permits through quickly. And then you just have to have costs that are workable. So California has some of the highest per square foot construction costs in the country. The trouble with the valve and the spigot is that if you open up one completely and the other 2 are still closed, or you open up one a little bit, you open up all of them a little bit, you don't actually get this gushing flow of homes, to carry the metaphor far beyond comfort. So, I think that's part of the challenge, right? Is we've made a lot of progress on some aspects of this issue. I think we've made a lot of progress on some of the streamlining stuff. There's still work to be done there. Laws like SB 330 have made it a lot harder for jurisdictions to arbitrarily deny housing. We made some progress on the zoning stuff. Legalizing ADUs, I think, has been absolutely huge. 1 in 5 homes built in California last year was an ADU. 1 in 3 in Los Angeles. So that's been huge. Laws like state density bonus, which give extra density in exchange for some share of the units being deed restricted affordable. That's also been fabulously successful. So some progress on zoning. Again, still a lot of progress to be made there, and we can talk about bills we're running this year. And the third is the one where we've probably made the least progress, which is the cost issue. Why is it so much more expensive to build in California, even when you control for the difficulty of getting entitlements and permits? Like, why does it just cost so much? And it's different standards, it's building code rules, it's arbitrary variation in rules, it's extremely high mandates for affordable housing. So that's hopefully something that we're going to work on in future sessions.
Well, let's talk about this session, because I know it's a big one and it's just kind of getting underway in California, and the big drama hasn't really heated up yet. But I think, tell me if I'm wrong, it sounds like there's a lot of energy around the legislation this year, and it's a far more ambitious agenda in California around housing. I know Chris Elmendorf tweeted earlier this year that California's pro-housing caucus has thrown down the gauntlet when he was talking about the CEQA reform bill. He's talked about the set of bills overall, saying they're far more ambitious and promising than anything I've ever seen previously. And he was tweeting pictures of like the Abundance Book and things like that. You have Governor Newsom saying he's handing out copies of Abundance to the leaders in the House and Senate. Is this a big year for how? Obviously, you can't speak to what's going to happen, but tell me about this slate of bills that California YIMBY and others have proposed this year.
Totally. The top line is this is the most ambitious pro-housing package that I think the state has ever run. This is bigger even than some of the early stuff that California YIMBY and other partners did. And I would like to stress too, almost every bill that I'm going to be talking about that we're working on, we have amazing co-sponsors, and it's the legislator who's doing all the hard work. But I'll talk about them as our bills, my bills, blah blah blah. Every bill is like a team effort, and so I want to stress that. But the preface here is I think there was a reckoning in 2024. I think voters came out and I think punished Biden, not because of, frankly, kind of weirdo issues about who is playing in women's sports or DEI programs, but because the cost of living had increased dramatically under the Biden administration, in part because of policies of that administration, in part because of just unhappy accidents, right? But in any case, Americans experienced 4 years of home prices increasing by about 40%, a bunch of other prices going up, and it freaked him out. And I think that's part of why Trump was able to win re-election, despite all of the controversy surrounding his campaign. So, and I think there was a special reckoning for Democrats of like, California just does poorly on this. I think normal Americans look at Texas and Florida, and then California and New York, and they might say, well, kind of freaked out by some of the like extremely socially conservative things that happened in those states. But if I move to those states, I can buy a big, nice house and have, live in a nice community that's clean and relatively safe and have access to lots of jobs. And making the rent is not even something that's going to factor. Whereas in California, California is a place that exports middle and working class people. I think most Americans and the rest of the country, they have a person who moved from California and does not have a lot of nice things to say about it. So there's a little bit of, I think, a reckoning with Democrats in California in particular of we have to fix this. Like this is real. This is not like conservative media gaslighting people. It's just like in California. California has real significant problems that we are empowered to fix. And you see this come up in some of the rhetoric of Ezra Klein and talking about abundance. I think he's completely right on this. So luckily, we have some really, really great housing champions who I think have been sort of almost doing practice runs over the last 4 or 5 years. I mean, I don't want to underplay the legislative victories in recent years, but we were passing smaller, more focused bills that in some cases were successful, in some cases were not, that I think got a lot of folks in the legislature aware of the real details of this issue and understanding how you do housing reform right, and how I think increasingly appreciating the harms of this kind of everything bagel approach that's been so heavily discussed of, okay, we passed a bill legalizing housing, but it's got all of these mandates and it's got all of these exceptions that ultimately makes the bill, and or it doesn't go far enough to close all the loopholes that it's ultimately ineffective. So we had a cohort of legislators who had been in these fights. We had a cohort of newly elected legislators who were like, look, I'm not beholden to any of the compromises you guys have made. I got elected, and the number one thing I heard from all my constituents was housing affordability. So we had that. We had old guard, grizzled champions, and a new cohort of very pro housing legislators. And there was a consensus of we have to fix this. I was at a conference recently, and somebody made a comment about how California is the main character of history, and I'm like, well, this is like the bottom. This is like the part of the narrative arc where it's like the main character wakes up in a ditch, hungover, with divorce papers in his pocket, and he's been fired from his job. Right? It's like that's where our main character's at, and it's like you're like, okay, we need to get help. Like let's like turn this thing around. We have a few bills that I think are finally doing things that we've have needed to be done for a few years. And I'm going to use bill numbers. If you're not engaged on that level, just let it wash over you. The first is SB 79. This is finally getting upzoning around transit stations. The state of California has spent billions of dollars on, frankly, some of the best transit in the U.S., if not the world, in places like LA and the Bay. And yet, so many of these transit stations, the zoning around them actually doesn't legally allow you to convert a strip mall into new apartments over shops, or it doesn't allow you to turn single family homes into more housing that our state needs. And so, of course, those single family homes end up becoming $4 or $5 million. So the simple idea of SB 79 is, okay, within a quarter to a half mile of our high quality transit, we should be allowed to build multifamily housing. I would say this is one of the tried and true YIMBY reforms. So if you look at like Minneapolis, their 2019 comprehensive plan update, that got a lot of attention for legalizing single family zoning. But actually the really high impact thing, and that was important, but the really high impact thing that the Minneapolis code did was it legalized mid-rise housing near almost all of their transit. And that's why Minneapolis had this building boom tear and saw prices fall. So that's SB 79. That's being sponsored by, or that's being authored by Senator Scott Wiener, who's, I think anybody who's has a pulse and pays attention to California housing policy knows he's fantastic.
The patron saint of California housing bills. Yeah, maybe that's too aggressive. I don't know, but
no, yeah, I think he's got competition for the title of housing leader, which is like a great place to be. But yeah, I think he took some body blows on this issue before anybody else was even thinking about it, and I have a lot of respect for him. I'll bounce around a little bit. Another bill that we're working on that I'm very excited about is AB 609. So this is an assembly bill being run by Assembly Member Buffy Wicks, another awesome housing champion. Um, I think she gave some quote to a newspaper recently of like, "Hey, I'm about to term out. I want to solve this problem. Let's do it." And I love that attitude. But AB 609 basically says, look, we should not be subjecting infill housing developments that we know to be good for the environment to these long and tedious environmental reviews that often cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and throw projects into endless litigation. It makes no sense at all. Virtually every other U.S. state does not do anything like this, but as some of your listeners might know, in California, we subject almost every new housing development to the California Environmental Quality Act. It has nothing realistically to do with environmental quality. It's a giant book report that can get you sued. The idea of AB 609 is if you're an infill housing project and you meet some very limited, like carefully targeted standards, you shouldn't have to do this giant environmental report. We should be able to say, yeah, this project's good for it's good for the environment to build housing in West LA. Okay, like case closed, right? Because of course the opportunity cost of every home not built there is a new home built in some place that's at much greater risk.
Let's talk about CEQA because it's kind of become a emblem of, I know in abundance, it's the example of ways that government and governance and bad laws can get in the way of something that most people agree is a good outcome that people desire. So as you're talking about, so CEQA is this law, it requires this book report to build pretty much anything. In abundance, they talk about how the original vision was not for it to be a blocker of anything that was built anywhere, but due to some litigation and some court rulings, it wasn't just about public programs. It was about any time anyone was trying to build anything in the state. I know you've written a lot about CEQA, and I know just maybe a week or two ago, you were tweeting asking for examples of your worst CEQA example. Can you give more examples beyond just infill housing, which is housing that's built in kind of already established, paved over urban areas? But what are other examples of ways that CEQA has blocked projects that you would presumably think were good for the environment?
Yeah. Well, just to give a little bit more history. So the original CEQA gets adopted in the 70s with, I think, pretty reasonable intentions. The government's building a lot of extremely disruptive projects, damming projects, urban freeway projects, etc. And the idea is, hey, we should do an environmental report to take account of the impacts of these projects. They should just have to disclose them. There should maybe be some obligation where if the impact can be mitigated by an alternative that doesn't really disrupt the project, you should take that alternative. Kind of no-brainer common sense stuff. And it originally was meant to apply to government projects. Again, projects that like happen at the scale of really, really disrupting communities. Then, of course, like so many policies that have gone awry, the courts get a hold of it and take it to a place where you end up with a policy framework that the legislature would never in a million years have passed, but this accretion of court cases has made it to where, oh, the government approving of a private project is a public project in a legal sense, so now you have to do CEQA. And by the way, we have all these cases where thousands of people have sued thousands of different projects alleging that this specific aspect of the project was not sufficiently studied. So all environmental reports going forward have to study everything that we've deemed at one point was potentially understudied. And so you get to this point where it's like you read some of the early environmental reports, for actual genuine public projects, and you're like, okay, wow, this is like 10 pages. Honestly, this could probably be a little bit like longer. Like you're building a new highway. Like, yeah, I don't know. I'm okay with like a 50-page like study for a new highway that's going to displace 1,000 people. Yeah, okay. Study the Jesus out of that. But now you're to a place where it's like you get these 1,000-page environmental reports for relatively small multifamily buildings that aren't even receiving any public funding. But so to your question, I mean, cases of housing NIMBYism abound. Um, if you don't like a project, it really costs you only a few $100 to go to the courts and say, I'm alleging all of these problems, and boom, automatically you're adding months of delays to projects. Very common. Also very common are just unnecessary delays associated with infrastructure projects that we know to be good for the environment. So, of course, this is partly why California just can't build transit efficiently, is that in many cases they have to undertake years and years of environmental reports. I mean, the California high-speed rail environmental report, which is, again, a project that I actually think, yeah, that should be subject to an environmental report. But it's like, what are we doing spending like 2, 3, 4 years and doing, hundreds of community engagements and then of course getting these projects ended up in the courts where they have to fight multiple different legal battles. It's like, okay, at a certain point we did the work, we disclosed the impacts, we picked the like least impactful alternative to the project, let's proceed. I mean, another absurd example was CEQA being used to delay like bicycle master plans, or CEQA being used to block the installation of bike lanes on the basis that, oh, the bike lane will cause more people to sit in traffic, and that will cause more emissions. And it's like you get this tortured logic from people who are like, if you don't like something, you just have to use the avenue of CEQA to block it. And so CEQA just becomes this like all-consuming monster that touches almost everything in California. I mean, I do want to have a little caveat, having just gone on that anti CEQA tirade. Um, CEQA is a big problem, and it has to get fixed. And we have some amazing bills to fix it. AB 609 will create an infill exemption. SB 607, which is being run by Scott Wiener, takes a slightly different approach, clarifying other aspects of state law. There are a few bills that we've passed in recent years, speeding up the process, which is all very good. Um, but this is yet another one of these necessary but not sufficient changes. You know, when there was the Republican recall of Gavin, the failed recall, um, all of the Republicans, it was like, "What's your housing plan?" And it's like, "Get rid of CEQA." And it's like, cool. Like, yeah, I think getting California back on a path to housing affordability is a necessary but not sufficient condition for like getting California building again. Like, so I do want to stress that sometimes SQL gets treated as like this boogeyman, this like thing that if we like solve it, all of our problems go away. I definitely don't think that. But at the same time, it is one of these things where it's like, okay, if we don't solve this, like we're realistically never going to solve the California housing crisis.
That's incredibly helpful. And it does get turned into that silver bullet, right? People think of only CEQA, shaking your fist at it. So that makes sense that it's necessary but not sufficient. And hopefully you all see some success with that bill. And while we're on the topic of the bills you have, I know you also have one on third-party permitting. Can you talk about permitting and what the bill would do and why you need a bill to change the system in the first place?
Yeah, I love this bill. So AB 253, this being run by Assemblymember Chris Ward, another great housing champion. So here's the problem. Uh, in California, the average apartment building takes about 15 months, a fully entitled apartment building. So it's gone to the planning department. The planning department has spent their own few months like hemming and hawing about the project. They've stamped it. They've said this is legal to build, go build it. Then you go to the building department to get your permits. In California, the step between entitlement and getting the permits takes about 15 months. And now some of that is just because the applicant delays. Maybe they don't file for the permits immediately. Maybe they submit bad plans and get reviewed. But we know that this is like many multiples longer of a process than in, again, states like Texas, California, or even neighbors like Arizona and Nevada. California is just really slow at issuing permits. And talk to anybody who's ever applied for permits, and they'll tell you it's like, well, the city just takes a really long time to get back. Every single step is a delay. And so the idea of AB 253 is to adopt international best practice, which is to allow applicants in cases where the cities have dragged their feet to hire licensed third-party architects and engineers to conduct the plan review. So the idea here is the permit review is not really in any sense discretionary. It's like, does this project, do the plans meet the requirements of the building code and any other associated state codes regulating the actual health and safety of the building? This is all objective and knowable, and it's the sort of thing that any licensed architect or engineer is theoretically legally empowered to check for. So what we do is we say, okay, for this first bill, if the project is 10 or fewer units, you know, that was just a compromise to make people a little bit more comfortable with the new policy framework. If the project is 10 or fewer units, and the city has taken more than a certain number of days, I think we landed on 30, to actually review the permits, then the applicant should be able to just go hire a licensed third-party architect or engineer who's not otherwise involved in the project. They should be able to review the plans. The applicant should then be able to say, look, here, city, this licensed third-party architect engineer review the plans. They signed off on them. You need to issue me a permit within 14 days or provide written basis for denying the permit. And the idea here is just to provide a safety valve. I think one of the things that we've done in recent years is we've instituted a lot of shot clocks. We say the government, this agency has to do that by X number of days. And it's like, that's good. That's a first step. But there's not really any meaningful recourse. The recourse is usually like, well, then your project is deemed approved, but it's not really clear what deemed approved means. And do you really want to go to the courts to like litigate this issue? It almost never ends up being meaningful. But the beautiful thing about AB 253 is it says, okay, there's a 30-day shot clock for you to get the permits out the door. And if you don't, this person's going to go hire a licensed third-party architect engineer, and they're going to put the plans on your desk with a stamp, and you're going to have very little legal basis to deny it. So that's one that I'm really excited about, and that one's actually part of the speaker's fire response package, because this is especially important down here in Los Angeles, where we lost 16,000 structures in January, and LA city and county permitting was already some of the slowest permitting in the U.S. Now we're going to deal with this intense surge of applications from people who need to get their permits signed quickly, and we don't have time to delay. So it's been bundled into the package, and it's moving forward. There's a companion bill to this, which is AB 1308, which is doing the same thing with inspections. So essentially saying if you can't get an inspector out in 30 days, the applicant should be able to do the same sort of thing. Hire a licensed third party who's licensed in some way to do inspections, and let them do the inspection. So that one's about to get heard, I think, in Assembly Housing.
I know Alexis Rivas, the CEO of a startup that builds ADUs, has been tweeting about his attempts to get permits and approvals for his ADUs. One that they had in the Palisades, another one in Sherman Oaks that was already a pre-approved ADU, but it was still just getting gummed up in the works in Los Angeles. And I think part of the reason it's gone so viral and gotten a lot of attention is people assume that these systems work. People assume that when a press release comes out, or you hear the mayor, you hear the governor saying, in the case of LA fires, we are actively working to solve this. We're going to cut red tape. We're going to streamline it. And then someone goes through and they document day by day the process of how long it actually takes. People realize the absurdity or challenges of navigating the bureaucratic maze of city permitting, and it doesn't become real unless you're someone who's actually trying to get a project through. Everyone else oftentimes just assumes that once something's written into law, once something is said that it's going to be fixed, it's fixed. But that's often not the case when it comes to these different cities and getting things approved.
That's such a good point. I mean, that thread has been great for just showing, like, yeah, all these declarations were made, but it's like there wasn't actually any meaningful policy change, and there was no culture change within the departments. And so you've not seen a lot of progress. Yeah, I would say, yeah. Well, I'm optimistic that things are trending in the right direction on this, just because I think in the aftermath of the fires, LA City and County have really been sort of the focus of national attention, and I do think that Mayor Karen Bass and Gavin Newsom actually do want to solve this issue, but it's going to take some just nuts and bolts, civil service management of like, let's go through and like re-engineer this process and get these projects through quicker.
I want to zoom out beyond just the single bills that you have this legislative session, but before I do, I know you all are in an active fight and will be in an active fight to try and get some of these bills passed. Like you said, it's the most ambitious housing agenda that you've seen. How can people get involved? If there's someone who's sitting there who's listening who says, hey, I want to be a part of the solution, I want to help build more homes in California, what should they do? Give a plug for YIMBY.
Yeah, well, so for us specifically, I think it's valuable. Subscribe on our website to get our emails and follow us on whichever social media platform you use. We'll do blast outs of, hey, we need calls to legislators. We need emails to legislators. Usually it's like a day of thing, or we know 24 hours in advance. So social media is the best way to stay plugged in for that. I would say if you're somebody who's never called or emailed your legislator, I can totally understand. It seems really scary and weird. You make a phone call, an intern picks up the phone, says, this is Assemblymember blah, blah, blah's office. You say, how can I help you? You say, I would really like the member to vote yes on SB 677, Scott Wiener's bill to fix SB 9. They say, thank you. I'll take that down and we'll pass it along to the Assembly member. That's the whole process. Was that scary? I wasn't scared. It's so easy. And emails, of course, are even easier. People always ask me, do emails or calls matter more? I don't think it actually matters that much either way. A surge of calls can actually kind of surprise an office, but it doesn't matter. So get involved. And when we send out action alerts, that's super helpful. I'd say if you want to get more involved, find your local YIMBY group. Almost every city and suburb and county in California has an active group of people who are meeting once or twice a month. They're mostly focused on local issues, but they are so valuable for plugging into the state work that we do. I think, California YIMBY as an interest group is kind of weird, right? Like, we're not an industry group. We're not a trade group. We're not interest group with this specific policy goal that we have a financial stake in. We're a movement. The only way that we have power in Sacramento is that we can say, hey, there are like tens of thousands of people across California who have our backs and who vote based on this issue and who donate based on this issue and for whom this is a life or death issue. That's why we have power. But that power only manifests itself in Sacramento when we have a ton of local YIMBYs who are active in their local chapters, who are staying plugged in, who make the phone calls when we need them, who pass up ideas to us. Almost all of our more technical bills come up from members of our base who are like, "Hey, I heard about this problem. I think we could solve this and actually make it easier to build housing." So get involved in your local YIMBY group. Two more things I'll say. One is if you're in a group that endorses state legislation in any capacity, you're in a professional group like AIA or APA. I'm an APA as a planner, or you're in any kind of trade group that endorses bills, or any sort of mission-driven group that endorses legislation. Support letters are so valuable. I can guarantee you the opposition is going to flood members' inboxes with support opposition letters, and we have to show that hey, there's an equally great, if not much greater, movement in support of these bills. And so support letters from groups that legislators know and recognize, especially from in their district, is very valuable. The last thing I'll say, California YIMBY, we have a lobby day. It's on May 20th. This is where we gather folks from all over the state. We schedule meetings with legislators, with a group of your neighbors, folks from your district. We help coach you. We help you identify which of the pro housing bills you want to focus on and how you should talk about them. We make it very, very, very easy. It's frankly really fun. You'll get to meet with your state senator and state assembly member. You'll get to meet with a bunch of other pro housing people from your area of the state. And then we have, of course, as with all YIMBY advocacy, we have a happy hour at the end of the day where you can meet YIMBYs from across California. So that's May 20th. And if you're interested in that, you can go check out our website, cayimby.org.
You too can have a drink with Nolan Gray and talk about all the exciting housing legislation that's going on. Thanks for talking through those. And let's zoom out now. I want to talk about what's possible for California. So this whole vein of writing, my own thinking, came from my own turning point where I previously was just down on California. I'm a fourth generation Californian. I would hear my family talk about what life was like, particularly around affordability. And there's a part of me growing up that felt like, man, did I just miss the party? Like, am I showing up and the lights are on and the keg's empty and everyone's kind of drifting out and I'm just showing up and I missed the exciting point. Like you were saying earlier, California is the main character. This might be one of the down points of the character arc. And so one of the questions I wanted for you to answer is, I know you've done a lot of analysis of international comparisons. You look at other cities. You're not just California focused. You look at planning broadly. Who is the best inspiration for California where it is? I know people talk about Houston or Tokyo or other cities. Like, are there places that Californians can look to show and know that, hey, this is real, this is possible. If we build, we can actually turn this thing around? Because I know for a lot of people, it just feels like rising costs in California is an inevitability that they can't avoid.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I totally sympathize with you. I always say, for me, it's like the California housing crisis. It's affecting and it's moving. But man, for the people from California, right? It's like, I'm from Kentucky, and it's like Kentucky has its own housing affordability challenges. But at the end of the day, I can go back to the place that I'm from, and it's never even a question of like, can I settle down here and have stable, decent housing? For my friends who are like from the Bay Area or from Southern California, I'm like, that is just, it's so ridiculous, right? Like, I'm at the place that you're from. It's genuinely like a question of like, do I need to leave this place to have a stable and decent life? So I empathize, and I'm optimistic that we're going to fix it. As far as comps, California is weird. It's really big. It's really wealthy. It's got a lot of unique environmental challenges. So comps for California are tough. Like, it's always very easy for me when I like go and talk to mid-sized cities. I'm like, yeah, Minneapolis did this cool thing, and Buffalo did this cool thing, and Austin's doing these cool things, right? Like, but at the state level, I think the best comp for us would probably be New Zealand. Another Pacific Rim jurisdiction. New Zealand had basically adopted the full suite of policies that were pretty similar to California. They had, of course, a debilitating housing crisis. And there's this kind of fork in history where it's like New Zealand did all the things that the first generation California YIMBYs were trying to do in the mid to late 2010s, and California did not. And certain places within California, specifically Auckland, really went all in on those policies early on. And what you've seen in New Zealand is, I think, actually kind of what was predicted. You had a big boom in housing construction, especially in the cities that were early adopters of a lot of these policies, and you've started to see prices moderate out, and I think in the near term will eventually start falling in a positive way. So New Zealand's a great comp. I think it's a great comp in terms of it's a place that had a crisis and fixed it. Now there are lots of lessons we can learn from other places that really never developed the type of housing crisis, but they're a little bit more foreign, like places like Japan that have a more national zoning system that's more ministerial, places like France that has a more thoughtful sort of fair share mechanism that actually seems to work. But New Zealand feels a little bit similar to California in many of these respects. So it's a really fantastic example, and there's lots of great research that's come out about it. But the more we can get, I think it's a great frame, because the more we can get Americans thinking about how other countries do some of this stuff, I think the more we'll start to converge on real, radical solutions that are necessary.
Yeah, it's very helpful. I've not heard anyone compare it. I don't know if "Please New Zealand, my California" fits on a bumper sticker, but we can workshop that and come up with something. And I think it's helpful too to have the international comparison, to see what's possible, to know what can be done. And I think history is also helpful in that sense. I know you've had a recent blog post I want to talk about titled "The Invention of the High Cost State." And I want to dig into this because people assume that California has always and will forever be more expensive than other places in the country. But you dig into the data, you have some great charts that'll show up while you're talking in the video version of this. But can you just talk through that post, the Stranger Things analogy, and then what some of the insights were from the data that you looked at?
Totally. Well, I'll leave the Stranger Things analogy. Folks can go read that. But I'll start a slightly different way. I was giving a talk somewhere in California, just giving my standard talk about here's the housing affordability crisis, here's what we got to do to fix it. And one of the questioners at the end, I think very innocently, was like, well, isn't Los Angeles just always going to be more expensive? Like, LA's got perfect weather, beaches, mountains, like unbelievably productive, information age industries. Like, come on, like, isn't LA always going to be more expensive? And it's like, of course, the flippant answer is like, well, no, come on, like, we just need to build a lot more housing. But I got to thinking, I was like, well, yeah, this person's asking a totally understandable question. The entire time that she and I estimate she was about the same age as me, the entire time that we've been alive, LA has been dramatically more expensive than other parts of the country. But when you actually look at the historical housing data, it wasn't always like this. There wasn't always the case that some states were dramatically more expensive than others, because there wasn't this variation in how hard it was to build. So you would have a huge surge of population to a place like California, but then California would build tons and tons of housing, and the prices would ultimately equilibrate, right? I give the example. I'd have to pull up the specific numbers, right? But in the 60s and 70s, the ratio of local median incomes to local median home prices in Houston and LA is broadly comparable. Like, your decision over whether or not you want to live in Houston or Los Angeles really isn't predicated on housing. It's going to be predicated on a bunch of other things. Now, of course, it's the number one consideration, and the ratio of median home prices in LA to median incomes in LA is, I think, like double, if not more, the ratio in Houston. And of course, it's a huge consideration. In the 60s and 70s, Texas lost about 10,000 people a year to California. Now, of course, the trend has reversed, and 25,000 people move from California to Texas each year. And they're not doing it because they love Texas's weather or mountains. They're doing it principally because that's what's necessary to find affordable housing, given what you earn. So it's this invention of what I'm calling the high cost state, that we've seen a handful of states, and really California and Hawaii in particular. New York, I suspect, would look pretty similar if you could decouple upstate New York, which has had a very different second half of the 20th century, from Metro New York, and probably to a certain extent similar story with Massachusetts. These states have become a lot more expensive, or kind of maintain their status as a lot more expensive. And then you look at a cluster of red states that in many cases have undergone incredible population and income growth. They've actually seen the ratio increase slightly, but there's not been this incredible hockey stick like there's been in California. And I say this, not to just beat up on California, but to say that, like, it doesn't have to be this way. And we know this because it didn't used to be this way. Like, something happened in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And to my mind, I think the most plausible explanation is, well, it seems like these two sets of states went on a very different policy trajectory. And the first set of states made it a lot harder to build. and the second set of states did not. And as a result, Americans are for the first time moving not to the most productive places, but to less productive places that are just simply more affordable. Um, I think another thing that I think a lot about when I was a kid, one of the more successful relatives, an aunt and uncle, lived in Sacramento. And Sacramento is still relatively affordable by California standards, but they were two civil servants. They had single family home, pool, we had a peach tree in the backyard, and then of course we arrive and being from Kentucky, where it's like you go from unbearably cold and wet to like unbearably hot and humid, and there's like a little 2 week span in the middle, which is actually now you should go to Kentucky in the next week or two, where it's tolerable. And go to a place like California, where it's like even in Sacramento, it's like whoa, the weather's amazing here. You guys have a great quality of life. Like to me, like, and I think for a lot of Americans, California was this like land of opportunity. It was like, cool, we can move here and dramatically improve our quality of life and get our slice of the American dream and our little slice of paradise and tap into the most amazing job markets and cultural amenities and natural amenities. And then over the course of the second half of the 20th century, California goes from that to this place of, oh man, like paradise lost, like everybody's leaving, everybody's moving away. It's like, I just think that's totally tragic. I think that's awful. And I want to make California a place where people are eager to come and build their dreams.
That's my own family story on both sides of my family. It was my great-grandfather moving during the Depression. He was in Kansas farming, and it was miserable, and came out, started growing oranges in Southern California. And my dad, just a generation ago, he was no one in his family had been to college, living in relative poverty in Alabama, packed up and drove across the country to Sacramento to stay at a friend's place for a while, and he Pell Grants and whatnot, worked his way through college and grad school and built a successful life. And that's what California has been for so many generations. I read Kevin Starr's long, multi-part series on California. Yeah, you have to love California. It tests your love of California when you're at page 2000 or whatnot. But it just talks about that. Like you're saying, it was the land of opportunity. And not only that, it's gone through waves of like post-World War II unaffordability, but an ability to build its way out and change that. So I love that post. I love talking about California history because it shows that things don't always have to be this way. In fact, they were not always this way. We're living through a period that is the exception to the rule of what California has been for its entire existence as a state.
Yeah, well, and I think this is like to riff on that a little bit more, like because I'm trying to get through the Kevin Starr series. I'm like 3/4 of the way through the first one. The first one.
So I'll say this before you dive in. The first one I think is the worst. I think you can what the cool part is reading it is you see his development as a writer. And I think early on, the first one, he leans way too hard into all the cultural, artistic movements that you can just tell he loves. And then later on, I think the one on the 20s and then the 40s and 50s is when the 30s are great too, because you don't know the history as well. Like you can see him really sharpen up over time and the narratives get crisper and he's less indulgent in the parts that he still highlights all of those artistic, cultural moments that he likes, but the narrative plugs along a little better. So if you're stuck in the first one, keep going.
This is what I've been told, but I'm a horrible completionist for this, and I'm like, I have to read it.
I was too.
It's good. You're exactly right. It's really focused on the culture. And it's really focused on Northern California. But I raise it because California's been part of like being on the frontier of history, so to speak, is like California encounters these problems first. They seem really hard and like impossible to solve. We start to develop solutions. Usually, ironically enough, other places implement the solutions quicker than we do. Like YIMBYism emerges in the Bay, but now we're in a kind of funny place where it's like it emerges in the Bay, it starts here, the opposition first forms here, like the counter-revolution first forms here, but like YIMBYism takes off in other states, and then everybody looks back at California and like, what the heck, guys? You created this movement and like you're not even on the frontier of it anymore. I mean, as the legislative director for California YIMBY, it does like I want us to be back on the frontier, but it's like part of why we're in this situation is like we're first to the problem, and so we end up first to the solution, but then we end first to the sort of counter to the solution, right? And so we're in a unique challenge, but yeah, it's the same sort of thing, right? Like I think a lot about like strange like Georgism or the ham and eggs movement or the California is this like ferment of places because we're at the frontier of a bunch of like social and economic phenomena that like new ideas about how society should be structured happen here, and it's chaotic and it's messy and it's frustrating. But honestly, in terms of like being in the policy space, it's like, where else would you want to be in a certain way? Would you want to be in DC where it's like you don't pass anything unless you can like slip it into a budget bill every 3 years, or where there's like realistically no new ideas happening on policy? Like, yeah, for all of its problems, like California is the place to be. And California is also, again, I would just reinforce this. California is a place that's fixed itself multiple times, right?
Mhm.
Like it's a place that's had like crises and structural problems that seem totally unsolvable that time and time again the state has fixed. It's not been pretty, it's not been fixed like as promptly as it should have, but it happens. Like the fight's worth fighting.
I want to talk about California culture. Rightfully so, our conversation so far is focused on policy because this is first and foremost a policy problem that will require policy solutions. But I know that California's culture and its identity, especially as we're talking about Kevin Starr and its history, is premised on a pastoral way of life. You know, it's expectation that you live, at least in SoCal, right, in like a craftsman bungalow, and you go and you pluck the avocado and the orange from your yard in the back to then walk in and make your snack. How much of a challenge is that, in your opinion, for fixing California's housing crisis? Because particularly in Southern California, so much of the land use model of the cultural identity is you have a yard, you have a pool, or at least you aspire to have that. And then as a result, the single family neighborhood, even if it's in West LA, one of the most productive, busiest, high value areas in the world, there's the expectation that, no, we should be able to maintain our single family zoning in this area because that's the California dream as we were told it over our entire lifetimes. Do you think that that cultural challenge is as big as some of the policy problems? How do you think about that?
Yeah, it's such a great question. You know, I think the actual form that the California dream takes changes. It always has changed. We're in a paradigm right now of a version of the California dream that was developed in the 50s and 60s at a time when land's abundant, everybody's getting cars, we're building these freeways, we're opening up tons of new land to development. The form that the California dream takes in the second half of the 20th century is a single family home on a large lot with a car commute. Uh, Part of the crisis that we face now is that we're at the end game of that dream. We achieved, I think, the outer limits of what that dream could achieve. You know, every piece of flat land within a 2-hour drive of downtown LA has a subdivision on it and or supporting strip malls and office parks, right? Um, we're at the end of that dream to a certain extent, and we're at a point where, oh, okay, the the deeper dream was actually, hey, can I move to this place and own a home that might look a variety of different ways and have access to great jobs and live in this place that has perfect weather and live in this place where I can be exposed to everything that the world has to offer from a culture and culinary perspective. Like that to me feels like the core of the dream. It's this place of I can go here and find opportunity and improve my life and improve the life of my children. Um, right? That's the core of the dream. And so how that dream manifests necessarily has to change as the physical conditions and reality of the world change. And I think people appreciate that. I think, of course, if you ask me, what's my dream home? My dream home is a mansion on an acre with a pool in Greenwich Village. Okay? You know, of course, right? And also I'm the only one who's allowed to drive in Manhattan. Uh, but like coming back to the real world, my dream home might be like, hey, okay, a townhouse in West LA where I can hop on a train and go to the beach, or I can hop on a train and be, you know, at a major job center where I have lots of great employment opportunities. A dream for me might be in LA where, you know, yeah, like traffic's bad or I have to pay a fee if I hop on the freeway, but I can also just hop on an e-bike and ride around and actually enjoy the perfect weather. Uh, you know, and I would say too, there's also a pretty robust urban tradition in California. I mean, San Francisco is one of America's great cities. Um, Part of why San Francisco is in the situation it's in is that hundreds of thousands of people want to live in San Francisco, even in its current very dysfunctional form. Right? To say nothing of like when this place starts to get itself together and clean up the streets and build a lot of housing and provide quality public services. Turns out that like hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people want to live on this little idyllic peninsula that juts out into the Pacific Ocean that has perfect year-round weather and access to beaches and mountains. Who would have thought, right? And the idea that it's like, well, okay, living in that context, I don't get a single-family home, but I'm within walking distance of all of these amazing opportunities and experiences, and I'm within walking distance of all of these people and communities, I think people understand that, hey, that's a alternative form of the California dream, and one that we didn't support and then came to a point of actively opposing over the course of the 20th century. But I think keeping the California dream alive involves us allowing for the range of options, allowing for a version of the California dream that might actually exist today. And so, yeah, it's a tricky cultural challenge. I just read a good book on this, "The Death and Life of the Single Family Home" by Nathaniel Lauster, where he talks about this issue in the context of Vancouver, of like interviewing people who how they make sense of the fact that an affordable home in a place like Vancouver increasingly became a condo. And it's like, yeah, a bunch of people who grew up in single family homes were like, well, this is kind of weird. I grew up in a single family home. I always expected that's what I would have, but I ended up in a condo. And yeah, in my heart of hearts, I still wish I was in a single family home because that's what I was raised in. And I would like when you become a parent, you're just like become as conservative as possible. Like I need to replicate my childhood for my kid. But you hear these people speak in this book, and you're like, well, they're understanding that hey, this was the best opportunity for me, and actually this is better. And then I suspect their kid is going to be like, well, yeah, of course, I love living in a condo and then walk to a park and a coffee shop. Like, I would never want to be out in a suburb where my mom and dad have to drive me around everywhere. So
It's so true. My
yeah,
mom has said like, oh, I just hope you kids have a yard one day. And my wife and I live in West LA in our apartment across the street from a park. We're like, that's kind of nice. We don't have to mow the lawn, but our kid has a playground 40 feet away. Like, this is a pretty sweet combination. I don't have to mow the lawn like I did growing up in the suburbs, and we're right next to Sawtell and all these other amenities. Yeah.
yeah, totally. I mean, I think it's just a different mode of living, and it's not for everybody. I mean, I think the important thing is to provide choice, give people options. You know, like a lot of Californians, I mean, objectively, they've not left. They're like, cool. Hey, I don't mind commuting an hour and a half out to Santa Clarita or whatever because I want to be able to have a home with a yard. And if folks want to do that and they want to pay the cost of that, sure, go for it. But the prices are pretty unambiguous that a lot of people want the alternative. A lot of young people, a lot of people who are retiring, who don't want to have to drive themselves everywhere or engage in lawn maintenance, or they prioritize, you know, being a really short distance away from the communities that they're a part of or the services they consume. They're saying, hey, I want to live in cities, and we're not providing that option. So this is the key thing to my mind is like, we don't know. I don't think we know with great specificity actually what the next iteration of the California dream will look like. And the way we hedge for that risk of getting it wrong is to allow for a maximum range of options, like allow for small lot homes, allow for ADUs, allow for apartments near transit, allow for apartments on side residential streets, allow for new homes to be built in places where appropriate, like on the periphery. To my mind, that's the angle. It's like allow for a range of housing types, and we'll see what folks really want.
There's two things in what you just said that I love. And the first is that the YIMBY movement and creating housing in general, it's not about forcing a single mode of living. It's about creating choice. It's not about forcing everyone, you're going to live next to a coffee shop in a small apartment and you're going to like it. No, it's about enabling those who choose to live that way to have that at an affordable price and who want to be able to live near job centers and in the urban environments to do so. But by no means are you advocating for complete elimination or abolition of the suburbs or anyone who wants to live and have a yard. Like that should still be an option. And the second thing that you liked, and I really want to think about this more, and this is probably what I'm going to think about the most when I walk away, is separating the aesthetics of the California dream from the substance of it, right? Is the California dream about having that bungalow with a yard and an orange tree in the back? Or is it about economic mobility, opportunity, being America, but only more so the place where anyone from around the world can come to push the frontier, to be living out on the frontier of human productivity, of human innovation in the cultural hotspots. That's so much more substantive, and it's less about the aesthetic. Not that there's anything wrong with a Craftsman bungalow. I love those. But yeah, I think there's a lot there and a lot of work to be done to articulate what that looks like and flesh that out.
Yeah, I mean, look, at one point the California dream was I want to go and find a bunch of gold in the ground and then like leave, right? And more recently, and I think more comparably, the Southern California dream, I think in the 19 teens and 20s was I want to go down there and own like a few acres of land and have my own what do they call them? An orange farm. That doesn't feel right. I should know this.
A citrus grove. Yeah, that was my great grandpa. That's what he moved here for.
Citrus grove.
He traded his farm in Kansas to come and grow oranges in Upland, which at the time my grandpa talked about when he was a kid. they would take the oranges and they would drive it to downtown LA on every Saturday. And there's only 5 stop signs between where my family lived, where I grew up 40 miles east of here, and downtown LA. Versus now, I mean, you look and every block there's a stoplight, it feels like.
Well, and I assume for your grandfather, great grandfather.
Great grandfather was the one who moved. My grandpa was a kid when they moved out.
Yeah, so I assume for your great grandfather, right? Like this is partly like just an economic thing of like this is a productive form of farming where I can pay the bills. But like you read cultural histories of Southern California, and it was like, okay, upper middle class plus person in the Midwest is like, I want to like move to Southern California and just have a hobby farm. Like I just want to like this is me being like imagining that I'm like a little land baron. Like my California dream is I have a huge house and like 2 or 3 acres maybe of citrus grove that like it's probably not making a bunch of money. Like you're not getting rich off of it, but you're maybe making just enough money to pay for itself. And then you're like, look at all of this land, look at all this agriculture that I'm engaged in. It's like it's Jeffersonian. And so, if you were to go to that person and say, hey, this is awesome. Like I would love this mode of living, but the reality of the California dream is it's not that. It's a single family home with a 2-car garage on a 10,000 square foot lot. That person would have probably said like, oh, well, no, everybody should get the California dream of like 2 acres of citrus grove and a big, beautiful Victorian mansion. Like, why are you lowering your standards? And it's like, well, because like, yes, that for you is an attainable California dream in the 19 teens, but for the person like you in the 1940s and 50s, the attainable California dream is the single family home with one orange tree in the backyard, right? And then for our generation, the California dream for many people, it might look like a 2 or 3 bedroom condo or a townhouse in a wealthy part of the state within walking distance of a park that has community gardens and a park that has lots of fruit trees that you can take home fruit from. I live in an apartment in West LA. We're pretty close. Viewer note, we're pretty close to each other actually. And it's like I live in an apartment. I'm not surrounded by orange citrus groves of my own. But I can walk to a park and there's a lime tree and I pluck limes from it whenever I want to make a drink or cook. So the nature of the California dream has always been changing, and we have to be mature enough to accept that that's okay and that's a good thing.
100 years ago, people were saying if there's not a chicken in the yard, I don't want it, and now people are questioning whether they want a yard or not. So normally I would end the conversation. I realize we're at time. I normally would end on talking about your hope for the future of California, but I feel like we covered that. So instead, I'm going to pivot and ask you just about your advice for up and coming writers, maybe people like yourself when they're fresh out of college, because I know you've had a lot of success in writing and putting yourself out there and developing a public intellectual life around an issue that you care about. If you're talking to someone who's 20, 22 years old and they're saying, hey, I have these policy issues that I think I care about, I want to get more involved, and I want to emulate someone like Nolan Gray, what would your advice be to them?
The best advice I got, so I'm gonna pay it forward, is if you want to be a policy person, you need to pick an issue and you need to eat, sleep, and breathe it. You like if whatever issue you want to do, right? Like find the key texts in that field, read all of them. Read the people in your field who are blogging and writing and posting. Like think about it all day, every day. Like if you want to be a policy expert, you have to make it your life to a certain extent. So for better or worse, right? Like there's a period of my life and continues to this day where I wanted to read everything that was written about zoning and where did this thing come from and why did it emerge and how does it work. So that's the first thing I would say. As far as establishing yourself as an expert, I think once you've done a lot of that work, and actually you should probably do this concurrently, you're not a writer if you don't write. I know a lot of people who like think of themselves as writers and like maybe they put out something every 6 months. You're not a writer. Being a writer involves writing every single day. It's like any skill that you want to cultivate. If you're a musician, if you want to be a serious musician, you have to play every single day. If you want to be a serious athlete, you have to practice every single day. If you want to be a writer, you have to write every single day. Set a goal. Start easy. It might be the case that the vast majority of what you write early on is junk, but set maybe a goal of like, when I was really early starting out on this, I was like, I want to just get a piece placed once a month, right? And pitching, it's a whole skill set to learn. But now, frankly, I don't even know if it's necessary. Like, start up a Substack and just start blogging your thoughts as you start engaging with the literature. Set a goal of maybe at least one piece a month, then one piece every 2 weeks, then one piece a week. It's a muscle that the more you work it, the better you get. And start writing, sharing your opinion. I would say like, there's a tricky balance between engaging with other people in your space working on this issue and maintaining your own individuality and originality. And I don't really know how to strike a perfect balance there, but follow your own curiosity, follow what's interesting to you. Spend a lot of time. I think there are a lot of people who maybe they do the first two things right. They become obsessed with a policy area. They start writing a lot, but then almost all of their writing is like in response to somebody else or in reference to like the flavor of the day conversation. And you need to be doing a little bit of that to just show that you're plugged in. But, for example, I just wrote a piece on the urbanism of Guatemala City because it's like my second home, given that my wife is Guatemalan and I spend a lot of time thinking about it. Nobody asked for that, but I suspect that that's the type of content that on some level imprints itself when they think of me. They're like, yeah, Nolan's got his like stuff where he's writing about YIMBY bills each week. And I had a post come out this morning on this. But then I also have posts where it's like I'm just exploring my interest and trying to develop new avenues of thought. And that can even mean like going and finding old books or tracking down the planning history or the zoning history of your city. Find your little niche. Once you've developed some level of expertise on the shared understanding of the issues, once you've gotten into a flow of you're writing a lot, find your little niche and start covering that. I would say for people who are interested in planning and zoning in particular, if you're in a city where it's like nobody's blogging about these issues, or if you're even in a suburb, like let's say you're in Metro LA and you might think, well, lots of people are writing about LA, but you're in like Torrance
Upland,
or you're
my hometown.
You're in Upland. There's probably nobody blogging or writing about this, and like you doing that can actually be really interesting. And if you do it well, you can really add to the conversation in an interesting way that nobody else can. So, those are my things. Make a policy your life, write every single day, and then try to find your little unique niche within this ecosystem.
That's great advice. Thank you so much for the advice, Nolan, and thank you for your time. It's been great talking to you.
That was a fun conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much for listening. I really enjoyed that conversation. I'm looking forward to recording more and sharing more in the future. Like I said at the beginning, the best way to follow is by subscribing to CaliforniaFutureSociety.com. Until next time, see you in the future.